4 stars are getting worse, and they have been getting bad for quite a long time now, and nobody's been discussing it. So let's talk about why, and the potential logic and cause for all of this to begin with. 4 stars. There's a lot of them, and all of them have varying degrees of utility, and today we're going to take a much deeper look at the state of Genshin Impact's 4-star units. This will have a primary focus on the ones who were added after the game's launch to discuss their overall strength on average, their shortcoming and potential, and then finally what to expect going forward after all of this. During the initial launch of Genshin Impact, we were met with a slew of 4-star units, with the most noteworthy ones being Xiangling, who was given to us for free, Bennett, and Xingqiu. Sucrose, for the most part, was overshadowed by Venti, given that he was the first banner character in the game and premier animo unit alongside Jean. And while we did have DPS on-field units such as Razor, Chongyun, and Beidou, those won't be the primary focus on today's video, because instead we'll be focusing on supports, as DPS units have largely remained relatively consistent, at least in comparison to what they could have been. Though, of course, there are some outliers. From the launch of the game, we've gained the addition of Yaoyao, Layla, Diona, Rosaria, Kale, Sayu, Sara, Goro, Kuki, Toma, Faruzan, Yunjin, and Candice, with Mika coming soon to our rosters. Of these units, Sara, Faruzan, Goro, and Yunjin are dedicated buffers, and they all have specific teams or units that they're meant to enable, and most of their potential is locked behind their 6th constellation, usually boosting crit damage related to their specific elements. Though their end goal and the purpose for their team remains largely the same, each have their own unique advantages and crippling disadvantages. For instance, Goro at C4 is able to heal his party for a portion of his defense. This is a trait that no other buffer except for Bennett has. Faruzan, for instance, has crippling energy recharge issues, something that is usually mitigated by her teammates. However, in her case, the main animo DPS units that she would like to boost, being either Xiao or Wanderer, both do not generate enough particles to reliably funnel into her. With the former, Xiao already needing a bunch of energy recharge himself because he relies so heavily on his burst, and Wanderer relying solely on his skill to a point where, unless you have C2, his burst doesn't really matter. Unlike Goro, who can rely on his skill, or Sara, who can rely on Raiden to help funnel energy into her, Faruzan and Yunjin are hampered by energy recharge issues that dramatically impact their ability to buff their teammates, and this is usually mitigated by their constellations, and this is a problem. But let's refocus here on the remaining units. Kale, Candice, Toma, Kuki, Layla, Yaoyao, and Dori. These are all either disappointing as units due to the constellation dependency they have, or simply inferior versions of already existing 4 stars. Allow me to explain. Kale applies Dendro less consistently than the Traveler themselves. The Traveler is a guaranteed unit, and while she's offered for free to all players, so too is the Traveler alongside their constellations. Toma and Kuki both justifiably received poor reception when they were first released. This was then rescinded with the release of Sumeru and the Dendro element. However, that begs the question, is that fair to sell or release a bad or broken unit and then come up with a solution a year later, upon which these former buried units will have new life breathed into the cold husks of a body? Layla is an inferior version of Diona due to her providing far less utility than her competition unless you have C2, in which case you might be able to justify her shield. Yaoyao inherently relies on you needing her Dendro application, otherwise she's beaten out by other healers in both consistency and versatility. Candice is likely benched on 90% of your accounts, awaiting the day where Kachingmans can find a decent enough way to make her work and a decent enough team for her to actually be viable in. That way all of you can brush the dirt off her shoulders and use her. All of these beg the question, have 4 stars gotten worse? And for that, I'll show you my account. This is my Genshin Impact account. I play a variety of units from 5 stars to 4 stars, and ultimately, I do think 4 stars have definitively gotten worse. However, it also depends inherently on what units you use. And I know that's a very vague answer. I don't like giving the it depends answer. But I do think that, to a degree, you may have actually seen a benefit from the 4-star characters if you use something like Dendro. But let's take a look at them all. As I mentioned previously, because you have units like Candice, who's all the way at the back, or Toma here, neither one of them are being used. But we also need to consider the fact that we've had units like Jinyan. For the most part, if you ask anyone who was around during the first, I suppose, year and a half of Genshin Impact prior to Inazuma, Jinyan was the outlier. She was essentially the only unit you could look at and say, yeah, she's poorly designed. Because you had units like Diona who were released, and Diona's kit works well, and her constellations improve that. Each of her constellations assists her in doing her job. C1 is just energy. C2 is additional shielding, and that benefits the co-op. And that actually applies to Zhongli too. His C2 also benefits co-op. We can look at C4 and we can just ignore it. But her C6 is just an elemental mastery gain. Every one of her constellations, every one of the constellations for the original game's units, or at least the early units, improve their capabilities and already build on what's there. None of them works to fix an inherent issue. None of Beto's constellations say be give additional energy recharge. Instead, you get a shield. Instead, it improves. Every one of these improves her damage, and that's what she's meant to do. Off-field damage. Zhangling does the same thing. Each one of these constellations improves their capability. But instead, what we're seeing now, even with 5 stars like Yaimiko, is a constellation that increases or assists in energy generation because they have high burst cost. And if we're looking at Layla, an individual who I actually got to C3, her constellations improve her shield, yes, but her shield at C0 didn't make her worthwhile enough to utilize over existing characters like Diona. And so if we're looking at 5 stars and 4 stars, and we're just taking a look at the comparison and what they've each done, Yunjin was released specifically basically to buff Yoimiya. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Yunjin has, a high energy cost, but overall her buffing potential works. Instead, what we're seeing now is units like Goro, who are specifically geared to Geo unit. And even if we're looking at him in his case, in comparison to somebody like Bennett, where is he? Bennett. At C6, Bennett buffs pyro damage, but Bennett also heals and gives attack. So overall, he's valuable for essentially most characters in the game. Goro, on the other hand, is solely meant to be used with Geo unit, but not all of them. Because he relies on buffing defense, you can't even look at somebody like, hypothetically, you're wanting to build a Ningguang. She likes attack. Noelle likes defense, but Zhongli prefers HP. Albedo prefers defense, and so does Yunjin and Ito. So what you're dealing with is a situation in which even the buffers can't properly buff their element to a degree where it makes it worthwhile. And Goro, because he relies on his skill, gets away with a lot of this. And I'm not complaining about that. Faruzan is arguably the worst defender. She has an 80 cost burst. In comparison to, let's look at another buffer. Bennett, we obviously have. Let's look at somebody like Candace. 60 cost burst. That's fine. The biggest issue with Faruzan is that she doesn't generate particles. And sure, her biggest boost is C6, but C4 restores energy. It's inherently building out an already existing issue. We have a high burst cost with low energy generation, to the point where you want to just stack ER on her alongside a Fab Bow, which is, a valid strategy. However, the point is, it shouldn't be a situation in which we're looking at 4 stars and 5 stars wondering at what constellation do they improve the energy recharge, at what constellation do they really get good. I believe that inherently we should have units in this game that are just good outright. If we're looking at Sino, for instance, there is nobody except Nahida who can properly supply enough Denjo for him to use. If we're looking at somebody like Yaimiko, she works great in Aggravate, and sure, that's fine. Because yes, this passive works wonderfully. I disagree with the strategy and the concept that a unit like Yaimiko or a unit like Kuki Shinobu should ever be released in a bad state and get good later on. I instead believe that we should subscribe to the general philosophy that a unit should be good at release, or at least decent. Toma is great with Burgeon, but if Denjo didn't work super well with Pyro, we wouldn't use him at all. Jinyan is still benched, and conveniently enough, the healer for Denjo teams, Yao Yao here, doesn't have to contend with Diona, doesn't have to necessarily contend with a Sayu, or Chi-Chi, if you have her. Her only real competition is Kokomi, because you can't use Bennett, because in the teams you'd ideally want to use her, you don't really want to use Pyro. She doesn't have to contend with Sayu, Animo and Denjo don't interact, or Jean. It's an inherent problem. I'm going to be blunt here. I don't think anyone really understands why Cryo or Animo or Geo don't interact with Denjo properly. I still think it's an idiotic decision, but I miss the days when we had our Rosarios releasing pretty consistently, when we had our really good 4-star units, and we didn't have a dud that was pretty much forgotten about upon release, or a unit where everybody's like, yeah, she has energy recharge issues, or where the first thing we hear about is all the issues she has. Let's be honest here, how many individuals who are, at least listening this far, are excited for Mika's release? I am. But I also know inherently his power will be locked behind C6, and he's going to be very niche. Faruzan works for Animo units, but there are only 2 Animo DPSs, 3 if you're counting Hazo. Goro only works for a subset of units. Kujosara, who I don't have on this account at all, works only with Raiden. Doesn't buff Yaimiko long enough for the duration to matter, or for it to matter fully unless you're doing her burst. So we're running into a wall where even the buffers who we have and who we are getting, Goro, Faruzan, Yunjin, are so niche that it's incredibly difficult to justify building them out. I believe currently Bennett is still better than Mika at C0. And it takes a couple constellations for Mika to really build himself out. But even then, Bennett still is better in a lot of scenarios. I understand. Hoyoverse doesn't want to power creep or build out these objectively extremely powerful 4-star units because we haven't gotten anyone on par with Xingqiu until Yelan. And no one's beating Bennett. No one's really competing with Fischl here. No one's competing with somebody like Beta. But that's also an inherent issue. If Xiangling remains the top tier unit she is and Dayak isn't competing, or even if we're excluding the 5-stars alone, we should have options. Options are incredibly important. Bennett is the only solid buffer unless you have a C4 Goro and you want to use him in a geo-specific team. If I'm building out and deciding to slot in another buffer like Candace or Kandake or anyone else like Sara, why is it that I don't have to forfeit the healing that Bennett could otherwise provide? I don't want power creep, but I want there to be variations of a unit that's worthwhile. I have no legitimate reason to build out a Dori. Why would you if you let's say hypothetically, you don't like the character's design or whatever. Or let's say you do. You're building her out because you like her. You're not building her out because she's good. And the same goes for other units. Layla. I could build her. I want to, but I know that objectively speaking, my Diona is going to do better. Because you stack HP and she provides more utility. I know that I could build out a Kale, but Dendro Traveler will probably do better. And this extends onwards. Kandake, are you really going to build this character out with the expectation that later on in some random patch, because of some random character, she's going to be good? And should that really be something we're expecting and anticipating? Oh, this character's bad now, but they'll be good later on, I promise you. I don't think that's fair to us as players or to anyone else. But that's just my general thought. What are yours? Leave those in the comment section down below and tell me, do you think 4-stars are getting worse, better, or what the situation is? Either way, if you enjoyed, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.